I'm sure they carried that live. I'm very happy to take some questions. Andy, yes.
Thanks very much. Andy Bell, 5 News. This morning the Prime Minister basically said leaving would be taking a risk with peace and ushered in the possibility of the continent returning to violence. He has a point, doesn't he? Though? The EU has played a role in making war between France and Germany virtually unthinkable, of military dictatorships in southern Europe moving into peaceful coexistence with the rest of Europe, of Eastern Europe being liberated. He has a point that the EU has played a role, at least, in preserving peace on the continent, and you risk there is a risk of plunging back into violence if you start to unpick that with Britain.
I don't think the Prime Minister can seriously believe that leaving the EU would trigger war on the European continent, given that he was prepared only a few months ago to urge that people should vote leave if they failed to get a substantially reformed European Union. We have not got a substantially reformed European Union. The thing is virtually identical to before. I think it very, very curious that the Prime Minister is now calling this referendum and warning us that World War III is about to break out unless we vote to remain. I think that is not the most powerful argument I've heard. Everybody knows that peace in Europe over the last 60, 70 years has been guaranteed by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I mentioned earlier the NATO intervention in Bosnia that was in the former Yugoslavia that was in the end decisive in bringing that area back to peace. The European Union, as you will remember, exacerbated the problems by the premature decision to recognise Croatia. And if you want an example of EU foreign policy making on the hoof and the EU's pretensions to running a defence policy that have caused real trouble, then look at what has happened in Ukraine. I think it's very, very important that we don't muddle up the role of the EU with the role of NATO, and to say that the EU has been the guarantor of peace on our continent risks, in my view, undermining that fundamental defence architecture that is the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, and has been primarily responsible for peace in our time. Michael.
You said, Mr. Johnson, that the EU is becoming a force for instability and alienation. In that case, don't we have a duty to stay and put a brake on that?
Well, thanks, Mike. I mean, I tried, I think, to deal very extensively with that very argument, because I think it is something that people intuitively feel that maybe we should try and help our neighbours by going for reform. And the difficulty is that we have failed to see any reform. We haven't produced any reform by our negotiating efforts over the last 6 months. The UK agreement, as I've said earlier, was delivered nothing by way of treaty change, no change on borders, no change on the contributions the UK makes, no change on anything. I think what that really showed people is that you stay in, they're not going to listen to you. So the best bet, I think, for thoroughgoing reform, for devolution in Europe, for a continent, for a programme to get a grip on what is happening, to end this sense of alienation, is to vote leave on June the 23rd and make the European elites think again about the direction they're going in. That is by far the best answer. Yes, Robert.
Just on this issue of the role that Europe has played in bringing peace and stability, in your marvellous best-selling book on Churchill, you did say the EU had been, quote, a spectacular success in bringing peace and stability to the continent. Have you changed your mind?
Well, Winston Churchill was very clear that the European Union might have its merits, but that Britain should have no part in it. And if you remember what he said was that the most important thing about our country was our democracy. That's the biggest export that we've made to the world, the most important thing that we have to contribute to the arguments in Europe. And at the moment, it is that democracy that is being undermined, and it is the undermining of that democracy in Europe that, in my view, is provoking this adverse reaction, and that is causing alienation and instability. Yes, Anushka.
Sorry. Anisha Sun from The Guardian. We're colleagues. You really, really want Brexit. But you must accept that there are some risks involved with Brexit, and I think the public deserve to know what they are. I'm just wondering if you could specifically say what the risks might be and how the UK would deal with them.
Well, I think that the greatest problem we've got at the moment, in my view, is the endless tendency to, in this conversation, to talk down Britain as a means of winning this argument. And that is the single biggest threat that I can see, is that people on the Remain camp will continue to run scare stories about World War III or bubonic plague or whatever it happens to be. And actually, they may in the end inadvertently do material damage to people's confidence about this country. We're a great country. We have nothing to fear. We are the 5th biggest economy in the world. London is the greatest city in the world by a very long margin. We lead the world in a huge number of sectors, and we will prosper and thrive as never before outside the European Union. And we will teach them a wonderful example. We will save Britain by our exertions and Europe by our example. Two more. Yes, sir.
James Maddox from the Express. Do you agree with many of your colleagues? I mean, you referred to the Brexit campaign as "We Happy Few." Do you agree with many of your colleagues that?
Well, actually, not according to the polls. We're quite numerous, but
yeah. But do you agree with many of your colleagues?
Well, financially, you know, they've got the big battalions. I won't deny it. They've got the money at the moment. They got the money.
Do you agree that many of your colleagues saying that this?
They got taxpayers' money.
Contest has been skewed by this £9 billion.
Well, I think, look, I mean, I think it's ridiculous. As I said earlier, that poor old taxpayers who are hard pressed enough. You've got the NHS under huge pressure, and they're taking £9 million out to spend on a bunch of leases. I do think it's ridiculous. I think, you know, it's a waste of taxpayers' money.
Given that,
well, they should, or if they're going to do it, they should at least do it fairly and give us £4.5 million.
Given that, could a future Conservative leader or Prime Minister, after the current one, bring this question back if there is still a Remain vote?
Well, I am confident that the British people will, in their infinite wisdom, will get the right answer on June the 23rd. That's what we want to see. Yes. Sorry, Sam.
Harry Cole from The Sun. Boris, you've just effectively accused the Prime Minister of deliberately misleading voters and the taxpayer.
I like the word, use the word effectively there.
Deliberately deceiving.
Effectively, deliberately.
Deliberately deceiving the public, in your view. Surely you can't really serve in this man's government if he's...
Would
you serve in a future David Cameron government post-Brexit or post-Brexit vote, given you saying he's...
I'm a humble ex-municipal toenail now dedicated to serving the cause of this country and trying to extricate us from the European Union, which is, as I say, ever more expensive, moving in the wrong direction, undermining our democracy. We're sending £350 million every week to Brussels. We are losing control of our democratic institutions. It is not right. It's not right for Britain. It's not right for Europe either. That's my concern at the moment. One more, last one. The last one? Yeah, no, Steve, it's a Telegraph.
Boris Stevens from
Telegraph.
George Osborne yesterday suggested that the next leader of the Conservative Party would need to be serious, sober and principled. Do you feel that you would fit that bill?
Well, I'm delighted that to discover that the Chancellor is principled, and it's a very important and sober and everything else, very important development. Laura.
Joking apart, Mr. Johnson, there is a very serious suggestion that's been made by the Prime Minister this morning. Do you think David Cameron is telling the truth when he's telling voters leaving the EU would risk peace on our continent? And just as it's Europe Day, would you give us that complete verse of ode to joy?
Right. Well, I mean, you can't have it both ways, Laura. I mean, it's a very serious point, and I think that people should think very hard before they make these kinds of warnings. The answer is no, I don't believe that leaving the EU would cause World War III to break out on the European continent. And as I've said, I think that the principal guarantor of peace and stability on our continent has been NATO. And what worries me now is it's the European Union's pretensions to run a foreign policy and a defence policy that risk undermining NATO. And we saw what happened in Bosnia. We've seen what happened in the Ukraine. It is very, very important in this argument that British politicians remember that we focus on the North Atlantic Alliance and that we keep the focus of Washington and of the Pentagon very much trained on the concerns of the whole of this continent and not to turn their eyes away. And that means keeping the focus very much on NATO. All the EU can do in this question, in my view, is cause confusion. And as we've seen in the Balkans, I'm afraid, a tragic instability for a long time in the Ukraine. Things went wrong as well. So focus on the North Atlantic Alliance. That is my advice. Okay, folks. Well, I think that Will Walden is drawing his hand across his throat. So we've come to the end of our session. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming.